Cynthia Arnson is director of the Wilson Center's Latin American program. She joins us just hours following an event here with President Juan Manuel Santos of Colombia. Cindy, I should first congratulate you on a very successful public event, the first for President Santos in his visit to the U.S.
Exactly. This was his first stop after a private meeting on Capitol Hill. There were 650 people that filled the Reagan Building Amphitheater to capacity. Obviously, a tremendous amount of interest in what he has to say, and in this very exciting moment in Colombia, which is on the cusp of signing a peace accord with the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, the FARC guerrillas.
Before we talk about some of the specific issues, could you describe the context for his visit? How long is he here? What is he going to be doing?
He's here. He arrived yesterday and will be here through Friday. The essential organizing principle of the visit is a celebration of 15 years of Plan Colombia, which was a major bipartisan effort supported over 3 U.S. administrations, starting with Bill Clinton through George Bush and now continuing into Obama, which has pumped about $10 billion into Colombia over a period of 15 years and has really been a key ingredient, not the only, but certainly a key ingredient in the transformation of Colombia to something that was really on the verge of state collapse in the late 1990s into a thriving economy and a place where there is, where there's a very strong likelihood that in the next 6 weeks or so there will be a formal peace accord signed with the guerrillas. This is a 50-year conflict, and that's not an insignificant task.
And he was very gracious in thanking the United States for its role in helping Colombia avoid becoming a failed state. When you talk about the economic progress, he used the term intelligent austerity. Interesting term. What do you think of that?
Well, I think it makes sense. Colombia is still growing much faster than almost any other country in the region. The IMF and the World Bank and the UN Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean have all put out these terribly pessimistic estimates of what economic growth is going to look like throughout Latin America and the Caribbean, negative growth rates projected for this year and next. Colombia is doing modestly well, about 3%. In prior years was growing, was one of the fastest growing economies. And what's happening now is that Colombia's major export is oil. It is not a major oil producer, but that provides 57% of the government's foreign exchange. And at a time of low prices, there are clearly going to be, there's going to be a need for cutbacks. Another thing that the president alluded to, which is, I think, something unique in Colombia, is the so-called Fiscal Rule that mandates that the fiscal deficit has to be reduced progressively year by year. So at a time when revenues are lower and you want to spend more, not less, on social programs, on health, on housing, certainly on reintegrating former combatants, there is a need for austerity, but not in a way that really cuts to the bone and takes away things that have been very valuable.
He described that as a fundamental right. You mentioned the peace process. This might be a good time, which was a majority of the discussion focused on that. This might be a good time to tell people watching if they'd like to see the entire event with President Santos, they can do so by coming to the Wilson Center website, same place you're maybe watching this, and they could find it under the Latin American program. But Cindy, about the peace process, we're approaching the deadline. Mm-hmm. And he said, of course, it could be a little early, a little late. The deadline plays a certain role, but is it looking good heading up to the March 23rd deadline?
I think it's looking very good. And the president was actually clear in pointing out that a number of people had criticized him for setting an actual deadline, that if you miss it, it looks like the process is failing. But I think it was a way of focusing everybody's minds on the fact that this cannot drag out forever. There was a sense when the talks first started that they would be concluded in about a year, that the patience of the Colombian public was limited. And I think that they are now in really the final stage where they are talking about the formula for demobilization and disarmament and reintegration, which is really the final part. The UN Security Council approved a resolution just in the last 10 days or so setting up a process by which the United Nations would be verifying this process, which is another key ingredient of an international guarantee and kind of accompaniment of the peace process. So I expect them to meet the deadline.
I thought he used a very effective analogy when he talked about his son, a paratrooper, and that the first time you jump out of an airplane, you might need a little push. And he described a group of people who've known nothing but warfare. 50 years, they've never lived under peace, and that the deadline might help be that sort of final push before you pull the chute for the first time.
Exactly, and I mean, we should be very honest. The peace process is very controversial still within Colombia. There are ardent critics, including former President Uribe, who notably did not come to Washington for this multi-administration celebration of the successes of Plan Colombia. It has been politically costly. The President Santos made that clear in his remarks, and one should not underestimate the kind of political heat he's taken over this.
Another interesting point he made is that you can't win an asymmetrical war without regional cooperation. How has Colombia done in that regard?
Well, one of the effects of the military successes throughout the decade of the 2000s against the FARC was to push them towards the border regions into ever more sort of remote areas of Colombia. And these were precisely the areas that bordered on Ecuador, bordered on Venezuela. The extent to which Venezuela continues or had been a sanctuary for the FARC is contentious, I mean, I have to say. But I think that the effort to reestablish correct, if not warm, relations with Ecuador and Venezuela was part of a logic of putting additional military pressure on the guerrillas that had been forced into these remote areas. And he knew that these further advances were not going to be possible unless those areas of sanctuary and the fluidity of the border areas, was ended. And I think that was something he did very effectively.
Another very interesting observation he made was about how many Colombians fear peace because they've never known anything but war. And he likened it to someone who's spent decades in prison and finds out he or she is going to be released. And it's a little scary to enter this brave new world. How ready is the country?
I think Colombia is very ready to be at peace. I'm not sure that I think a lot of people are going to want to wait and see what this means, what kind of actions the FARC will take, whether they will simply reconstitute themselves and join other forms of organized crime and criminal gangs, of which there are still, a lot in Colombia. It's a very serious problem. And I think the Colombian public is ready, but there is a deep hatred of the FARC for the kinds of attacks on the civilian population, the devastation of not only economic infrastructure, but environmental damage caused by sabotage, repeated hundreds, if not thousands, of attacks on the oil pipeline. And there is a real, I think, reluctance. And one thing that has been shown in a number of public opinion polls is that the people in the areas in the countryside that have borne the brunt of the conflict are the most open to reconciliation. But the percentage of Colombians that actually live in rural areas is much smaller than those that are in urban
population centers.
Exactly.
Sure. Well, final thought, I've asked you a lot of questions based on things that impressed me during the event. What haven't we talked about that you'd like to mention?
I think we've covered most of the main points. I think it was interesting to me that this celebration of Plan Colombia comes not only on the 15-year anniversary, but also when Colombia is this close to making peace. And the first words out of President Santos's mouth were thank you to the American public and to the Congress and the U.S. government for supporting Colombia. But I think there's also an undercurrent, which was not discussed directly in the president's speech, but I know is going to be discussed on Capitol Hill, of needing additional resources and continued resources to consolidate the post-conflict period. You cannot sign a peace accord,
Right.
wash your hands
That's
of the
a
thing
beginning,
and
not
say,
an ending.
exactly, and say, case closed, move on. I mean, there really will be a need to stay the course and to remain involved in the foreseeable future.
Sorry about that. I would encourage you to watch the entire event. It was actually very memorable, and a great story I'll tease for you where the President Santos talked about building political relationships. In this case with Hugo Chavez, told a great humorous story, but we won't give that away. You have to watch. Cindy, congratulations! Terrific event to you and the Latin American program, and thanks for joining us to debrief it.
Great. Thanks for the invitation.
Thank you.
Terrific.